Now, I love the idea that we are all getting the chance to know each other. I'm not sure how many I think I know a lot of you, but my name is Jessica Graham. I am one of the new pastors here at Faithbridge, and it's still a joy to be with you. The joke used to be, I probably shouldn't have said it that way. As it's coming out of my mouth, I'm going, wrong, bad. I'm glad you guys have a sense of humor. The joke used to be that the first year the congregation would get to know the pastor. The second year, the pastor would get to know the congregation, and by the third year, they were out the door. So, this is one of the things that you'll get to know about me, though, is that I have a little bit of a unique background in that I didn't grow up in church. I actually grew up in a bar. Now, that sounds weird for a pastor because, usually we're born on pods somewhere on another planet. So even a tavern sounds weird. But I spent my growing up and formative years in the tavern that my parents purchased when I was 4 out in Iowa. And my dad actually still owns that bar out on the Mississippi River. But I spent a lot of time there when I was a kid. My dad would work mornings, and I would take my naps on the pool table. And I loved that I got to sit around with all the old veterans and hear war stories. It was the coolest thing in so many ways. But as I got older, my mom decided that it was time for us to go to church. And I tell you what, I kicked, I screamed, I cried. I was absolutely terrified of church. What exactly I was afraid of, I don't know. I think it was the lightning bolt. But after we had church shop for a while, I walked into the local Methodist church that was in town. And lo and behold, the boy from my class that I had a crush on was there. Church didn't seem so bad. Yeah, I'll go to youth group. Yeah, I'll join the choir. Sure, I'll do all of that. It sounds terrible. But the reality is it's what got me in the door and got me ready to hear the things that God was saying. And it took a number of years. But as I began to know and fall in love with Jesus and make that cultural change from bar to pew, I realized there were things from the bar that didn't necessarily transfer well to church. But there were things that did. And one of the things that did transfer very well was community. When we're really honest, all of us kind of want that Cheers experience, right? We want to fit in. We want to be where people are happy to see us. We want to feel known, and we want to know others. I'm happy to see them, they're happy to see me. Now, I remember some of the people in particular, and my mom's here, and she'll get a good laugh out of this because she'll remember these guys too. We had Bobby T. Bobby T was an inventor, and he would bring in little trinkets to the bar all the time and give me little things to play with and take home and do, and he always walked around like this. I don't know why, but I remember that. We had Frankie the Mooch. Yeah, we actually called him Frankie the Mooch. And he always came with his pocket full of dum-dums, and he would hand out suckers in the bar. And as a kid, hey, you can't get better than suckers, right? So I was happy. And sweet JD. I texted my dad last week and said, is JD still around? And he is. Well, JD was a Vietnam veteran, and he had some significant mental health issues from that. When he was sober, you wouldn't have known it, but he was the sweetest, most animated, most dramatic man I had ever met in my life. And he called me Sunshine. So we'd see each other walking down the sidewalk, and he'd go, Sunshine! These people for years were my community. They were the people that I felt this sense of belonging with, and I didn't know anything else. And I loved it. As people, we crave that kind of community. The question is it more than familiar faces? Is it more than just sharing a few laughs together and having those how's the weather kind of conversations? I want to know what community looks like to you. But more importantly, what is Christian community supposed to look like? What are we called to? What are we striving for? Today we're going to dive a little bit into the story of Lazarus and his rising from the dead. In this text from John's gospel, there are some very valuable notes here in community. Perhaps not what you're expecting, and that's kind of what I'm hoping for. We want to talk historically about some of what community meant and looked like in the ancient Israelite culture. But we also want to touch on, for us as people of faith, what are the things we can pull from this story that we need to integrate into our definition of community today. But before we tackle that community section, I want to give you a little background on this story. We want to set the stage a little bit so you know what's going on. This recounting of Lazarus' rising from the dead in John's gospel is Jesus' final miracle before his resurrection. So you can imagine here the tension is building before reaching that pinnacle. Things are getting more and more tense, more and more dangerous for Jesus as he's traveling. Prior to this, he had been in Jerusalem, where he had almost been stoned to death, and he leaves Jerusalem, and he goes over here to Bethany on the other side of the Jordan. And he's about 20 miles away from Jerusalem at this point when he receives a letter telling him that Lazarus is ill. Going to see Lazarus meant returning to Jerusalem, right? That's where he is in danger. So the disciples, of course, discourage him from going. Jesus says, well, too bad. He's good at saying things like that, right? Too bad, I'm going anyway. So they arrive, and of course, Lazarus has already passed. That's the heart of the story. Not only had he passed, he had already been dead 4 days. So now last week, how many of you remember Pastor Dan talked about that Jesus took his sweet time getting to Lazarus, right? You remember him saying that? So I started thinking about this. I'm going, wait a minute. Jesus took 4 days or more to travel 20 miles. He really took his sweet time. He knew what he was doing. He had a purpose in this, obviously. So let's talk context here. Something important for us to realize is in that ancient Jewish culture, mourning the death of a loved one had set practices and customs, right? Just like we do. Burial took place very quickly. It was typically within 24 hours. And that's why we see John 11:17. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. So once someone passed, immediately there would begin this ritual of mourning and prayers. And in particular, one of these portions was a 7-day grieving period called the Shiva. And during the Shiva, this was, as I said, this ritual of mourning for the dead. All other obligations were to be put on hold. The goal of this was that anything considered normal routine was to be interrupted. No bathing, no shaving, no haircuts. Mirrors would be covered in black cloths. All of those things were part of it. Everything was supposed to feel different because you were in mourning. Also during this time of mourning, friends and family would gather together and offer condolences to those we were grieving. Sounds like our funerals, doesn't it? Very much the same. But an interesting part of this is that what we see in the Jewish tradition is that mourners were to stay with those who are grieving. How many of you, when you're grieving, want a house full of 100 people? Doesn't that sound like a party? That sounds awful. But that was part of their tradition, which is why we see in John 11:31, when the people who were at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep. So since I jumped around the story a little bit here, Jesus shows up, Lazarus is dead, and he goes to the tomb, and Mary jumps up to follow him, and everybody goes with her. That's part of their community. Their culture is that the mourners would follow the grieving. So they all traveled to Lazarus' tomb. They didn't go because they were expecting Jesus to raise Lazarus. They went because this was part of their community and their culture. There is more here, though, to mention about community. This is where it gets to kind of the rubber meets the road stuff. We're going to go back to John 11:3. So the two sisters, Martha and Mary, sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is very sick. They're expecting him to come. Again, he took a long time. But this is our first important note about community. Communities share. And you're looking at me going, well, duh, I know that. But this is important. Rubber meets the road. Sometimes we need to know who to share with and when. We all know we're not supposed to gossip. So sometimes you go, well, I need to tell this person, but am I telling because it's gossip or am I telling because I need to know? And we ask ourselves that question. It's a good question to ask. Here's how you determine that answer. Who am I telling this message to? Am I telling someone who's there to provide healing and hope? Someone that's going to reach out to the family, someone who's going to provide comfort. How will this person I tell receive that message? How will they respond? How will they treat it? It is important when we talk about healthy, strong, good community. In those cases, it is good for us to reach out to those who can provide support, who have a healing touch. Sharing in community is good and it's healthy when it's done right. So how many of you have seen the movie Inside Out? And I bet you it's more than last service. Yes! Okay. All right, so Inside Out I absolutely love because it is the emotions inside the head of a 10-year-old girl after her parents move across the country. And what's so neat is this young woman, Riley, is struggling with how to handle her parents' move because she's always been the happy kid. And she wants to keep being the happy kid, but finally she cracks and she runs away from home. And when she returns, her parents are like, what in the world is going on? I had no idea. And she finally tells her parents how difficult this has been on her. And she shares. And once she shares that struggle, she's in a family that they received that message well. They treated it with care. She knew who she could go to. That is the thing that brought healing in her family. That's healthy community. Doesn't matter if it's church, if it's home, if it's your friend group. Healthy community is built on honest sharing in good ways. Not only is there that vulnerability which encourages others to share and be open and to be honest, it's also the idea of, look, if we don't know, we can't help. Sharing enables outreach. Sharing is the thing that equips and empowers our communities to operate the way communities are meant to operate. Communities share news. They share emotions. This is the way that it moves from us knowing one another with our heads to understanding one another with our hearts. That's Christian community. Church, we want to be a place that knows one another with our hearts, don't we? All right, amen. John 11, 43 through 44. We're going to jump ahead here. So this is, of course, Jesus is raising Lazarus now. Then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, and his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, unwrap him and let him go. Isn't it funny when you read that? It says, the dead man came out. Can you imagine the shock and the startled, the incredible? We hear these stories so often, we don't often think about what that looked like to people. Jesus calls Lazarus from the tomb, but who unwraps him? It's the community. It says, Jesus told them. Well, who's them? Well, we know it's Mary, and we know it's Martha. We know it's the disciples who were friends. And it's that whole crew of mourners, the family, the friends, all of those people who had been surrounding Lazarus his whole life. Think about what a funeral looks like to us today. Imagine a funeral full of people witness this miracle, and then Jesus says, unwrap him. let them go. Communities heal. You've been in that place, haven't you? Where you feel like you've been called out of the grave, where you know you've been called out of the darkness by Jesus himself, and it feels like for the very first time you are alive again, but you're still a little wrapped up. The bandages are hard to remove because your hands are stuck, and you're stumbling around because your feet are still a little bit tied up. You haven't moved a while, so you're pretty stiff. You're learning new habits, new ways, new patterns. It is like everything in your life just changed, but you're still learning what that actually means. Learning to live like someone who has been set free takes time. It takes patience. And often it takes someone side by side with you, modeling and teaching and mentoring. Guys, that's that community removing those grave clothes. Your old ways, thoughts, and habits, they need time to come off. You need people to teach you how those things can be removed from your life. That is what Christian community is meant to be. Christ-filled people following and continuing that work of Christ, the one who called us from the grave. When I say community heals and unwraps you, that's what I mean. We're continuing the work of Christ. Isn't that what we all crave? We all want that Cheers experience, right? We want to be known, but it's more than that. We want more than how's the weather conversations. We want to be in a place where we feel brought in, where we feel loved and deeply understood. We have a desire to be encouraged, to grow, to change. Let's, as a church, be the kind of people who rally around those who are wrapped. Let's be a place that is so full of God's Spirit that we are working to continue the work of Christ in the life of those struggling. Let's help remove those grave clothes.